I held my breath just to test it. Total silence. Then, a wet, ragged gasp exploded from the empty room next door. At the exact same microsecond. We thought we were alone in room 404, but something behind that wall is recording our lives. And playing it back with a hunger that shouldn't exist. The tires of the old SUV crunched rhythmically over the frostbitten asphalt of the Vermont backcountry, a sound like grinding bone. Century-old pines crowded the narrow road, their gnarled branches reaching out in the beam of the headlights like skeletal fingers clawing at the passing metal. Every turn of the steering wheel felt heavy as the fog began to coil around the base of the trees, swallowing the traces of the world they had left behind. The forest was an impenetrable wall of obsidian, broken only by the flickering reach of the car's lamps, casting distorted shadows that danced across the hood and vanished into the darkness. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the comforting, worn scent of vintage leather and the faint, metallic tang of an old heater working overtime. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the dark rim, while Sarah watched the blurred silhouettes of the trees through the passenger window. There was a shared tension in their silence, a mutual hunger for the isolation they had sought away from the crushing roar of the city. The dashboard clock hummed a low, electric frequency, its amber glow reflecting in Sarah's eyes as she leaned her head against the cool glass, listening to the rhythmic thrum of the engine. The Pine Ridge Hotel emerged from the mist like a bleached ribcage, a Victorian structure of graying wood and sharp gables that seemed to lean precariously against the slope of the hill. Not a single light flickered in the windows of the upper floors, making the building appear more like a monument to the past than a place of rest. As Mark killed the engine, the sudden absence of the motor's vibration left a ringing vacuum in their ears. The sound of the wind whistling through the eaves was the only greeting, a dry, mournful sigh that seemed to warn them of the stillness waiting within. The heavy oak door groaned on its hinges, releasing a gust of air that smelled of ancient beeswax and the parched dust of 1,000 unread books. The lobby was a cavern of amber shadows, dominated by a single, low-wattage lamp that hummed on the reception desk. Its light struggled to reach the corners of the room, where the wallpaper was peeling in long, jaundiced strips like sunburnt skin. Each step they took across the floorboards elicited a sharp, rhythmic protest from the wood, a sequence of cracks and moans that echoed up into the dark well of the staircase. Behind the counter sat a man so still he might have been a part of the furniture, his frame draped in a suit that looked as though it had been tailored for someone far more substantial. His skin was the color and texture of yellowed parchment, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too large for his fragile neck. He did not look up as they approached, his clouded eyes fixed on a spot somewhere behind them, yet his presence commanded the air, turning it cold and stagnant. His breath was a shallow, papery rasp, the only sound in the room besides the frantic ticking of a grandfather clock in the shadows. Without a word, the administrator slid a heavy, leather-bound ledger across the polished wood of the desk, followed by a single sheet of paper. The document had been produced by a manual typewriter, the ink uneven and the letters bitten deep into the fiber of the page. It was a simple, stark command, an agreement of absolute silence after 23 hours 00 minutes. The formality of the request felt out of place, a strange intrusion of rigid order into their romantic getaway, yet the weight of the paper felt immense between Mark's fingers. Mark caught Sarah's gaze and offered a brief, dismissive smirk, a silent attempt to rationalize the eccentricity of the old establishment. He took the heavy fountain pen and scrolled his signature across the bottom of the page, dating it the 30th of December, 2025. The scratch of the nib against the dry paper was unnervingly loud, a jagged, tearing sound that felt as if it were being carved into the silence itself. As the final stroke of the pen clicked against the desk, the air in the lobby seemed to tighten, as if the house had just taken a collective breath. As the clerk reached out to retrieve the signed agreement, his long, spindly fingers brushed against the back of Mark's hand. The contact was a physical shock, the skin of the old man feeling unnaturally cold and dry, devoid of any pulse or warmth as if it had long ago been drained of blood. Mark felt a primal shiver travel up his spine, a sudden, inexplicable urge to pull his hand away and flee back into the night. The clerk's touch lingered for a fraction of a second too long, a silent, chilling seal on the pact they had just made. From beneath the counter, the man produced a heavy brass key attached to a tarnished fob, the number 404 engraved deeply into its surface. He placed it on the counter with a sharp, metallic ring that sliced through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. The vibration of the strike seemed to linger, humming through the wood and into the soles of their feet long after the sound should have faded. The key lay there, reflecting the sickly yellow light of the lamp, a cold piece of metal that promised them entrance to a room where the silence was no longer a suggestion, but a requirement. The ascent to the 4th floor felt like a slow immersion into a deeper, more pressurized layer of the ocean, where the air grew colder and the light more fragile. The staircase was a spiraling spine of dark, polished mahogany that groaned under their weight, each step producing a unique, sharp crack that seemed to travel upward through the soles of their shoes and settle in their marrow. Mark led the way, his hand gripping the cold banister, while Sarah followed close behind, her eyes fixed on the rhythmic movement of his heels against the frayed red carpet. The shadows cast by the flickering wall sconces stretched and contracted with every step, creating the illusion that the walls themselves were breathing in a slow, rhythmic cadence. By the time they reached the final landing, the silence of the hotel had become a physical weight, pressing against their chests and making every breath feel like a conscious effort. The hallway of the 4th floor stretched out before them like a long, velvet-lined throat, illuminated only by a series of dim, amber bulbs that pulsed with a low, electric hum. The carpet here was thicker, a deep crimson that swallowed the sound of their footsteps entirely, leaving them moving in an unnerving, ghostly vacuum. Mark held the brass key in his palm, feeling the cold metal sap the warmth from his skin as he searched for the number 404 among the identical, darkened doors. The air smelled of dormant dust and the faint, sweet rot of old wood, a scent that spoke of decades of stillness and the slow, inevitable decay of things left undisturbed. When they finally stood before their door, the shadows seemed to gather in the corners of the ceiling, watching them with a patient, unblinking intensity. Inserting the key into the lock was a struggle of cold metal against frozen tumblers, the mechanism resisting with a stubborn, grinding sound that felt jagged and loud in the hallway's oppressive hush. Mark had to lean his weight against the heavy oak panel, feeling the vibration of the lock through his shoulder before it finally yielded with a deep, authoritative click. The door swung open slowly, its hinges singing a high-pitched, metallic lament that set Mark's teeth on edge and sent a fresh wave of goosebumps down Sarah's arms. They stepped across the threshold, and the air of the room rushed out to meet them, carrying a sharp chill that felt like a sudden plunge into subterranean depths. The door closed behind them with a heavy, final thud, sealing them into a space that felt entirely disconnected from the rest of the world. The interior of room 404 was a vast, cavernous expanse that managed to feel claustrophobic despite its size. The walls were draped in heavy, forest green wallpaper with a faint, velvet-like texture that seemed to absorb what little light struggled from the single, ornate chandelier hanging from the center of the ceiling. The pattern on the walls was a repeating motif of dark vines and thorns, so dense and intricate that the eye could never quite find a beginning or an end to the weave. The chandelier itself was a skeletal arrangement of brass and dusty crystal, holding 3 bulbs that cast a sickly, jaundiced glow over the furniture. This light did not illuminate the room so much as it highlighted the depth of the shadows lurking in the corners and under the heavy, claw-footed wardrobe. Sarah moved to the center of the room, her silhouette appearing small and fragile against the towering backdrop of the dark walls. She placed her suitcase on a low, wooden bench, and the sound of the leather striking the surface was a dull, hollow thud that died almost instantly in the heavy air. Her movements were deliberate and unnaturally quiet, her fingers fumbling with the silver zippers as if she were afraid to disturb the layer of dust that coated every horizontal surface. The sound of the zipper was a sharp, rasping hiss that echoed off the ceiling, making Sarah pause and glance toward the shadows near the ceiling. She did not speak, her throat feeling constricted by the thick, stagnant atmosphere, but her eyes remained wide, tracking the way the dim light glinted off the dark glass of the mirror above the vanity. The window at the far end of the room was a tall, narrow aperture that looked out onto an absolute, lightless void where the Vermont forest stood in silent vigil. As Mark approached the glass, he saw his own pale reflection staring back, a ghostly twin suspended against the blackness of the trees. The wind had picked up, and the long, skeletal branches of the pines began to scrape against the pane with a rhythmic, tentative sound. It was not a violent battering, but a series of soft, insistent taps that sounded like bone clicking against glass, or 100 tiny fingers testing the strength of the barrier. Each scratch left a faint, almost invisible mark on the exterior of the glass, a frantic, Morse code signature of the wild, unmonitored world outside. Turning away from the window, Mark reached for the bottle of wine he had carried up from the car, his fingers seeking a familiar, domestic comfort in the cold glass. He gripped the neck of the bottle and began to work the corkscrew, the metallic screech of the spiral entering the cork sounding like a muffled scream. He pulled upward, his muscles tensing, until the cork finally escaped with a resounding, hollow pop that seemed to ripple through the room like a physical wave. The sound did not fade as it should have. Instead, it traveled into the adjacent bathroom, bouncing off the cold, white tiles and the porcelain basin. It returned to them a second later, a distorted, mocking echo that sounded less like a cork and more like a heavy, wet strike against a stone floor. They sat together on the edge of the bed, the mattress yielding beneath them with a prolonged, agonizing groan of rusted iron and dry timber. The sound of the springs was a series of sharp, discordant notes that seemed to vibrate through their very bones, a mechanical protest from a piece of furniture that had perhaps not held the weight of the living in many years. The bedspread was a thick, scratchy wool the color of dried blood, and it smelled faintly of cedar and something sharper, like old chemicals used to preserve a specimen. Mark poured the wine into 2 thick glasses, the liquid falling with a heavy, viscous gurgling sound that was the only life in the room. They drank in silence, the dark red wine tasting of iron and earth, while the shadows in the room seemed to creep inches closer with every blink of their eyes. On the wall opposite the bed, a large, circular clock sat encased in a frame of dark, tarnished wood, its face a pale, yellowed disc that looked like a cataract's clouded eye. The minute hand was a jagged sliver of black metal that jerked forward with a heavy, mechanical clunk, marking the passage of time toward the arrival of 11 o'clock. Every 60 seconds, the internal gears of the clock would whir with a dry, grinding friction, followed by a thick, oily click that felt like it was happening inside their own skulls. The sound was so consistent, so relentless, that it began to sync with the beating of Mark's heart, a rhythmic counting down that made his chest feel tight and his pulse firm with a dull, thumping ache. There was no grace in the clock's movement, only a cold, mathematical march toward the hour they had promised to honor with silence. As the time crept closer to the designated hour, a strange, sensory phenomenon began to take hold of the room, a thickening of the silence until it became a tactile presence. It was as if the air had been replaced by a dense, invisible fluid that muffled their hearing and intensified the internal sounds of their own bodies. Mark could hear the wet slide of his eyelids every time he blinked, and the rush of blood through the veins in his ears sounded like a distant, surging tide. The absolute lack of external noise from the hallway or the other rooms was not a relief, but a source of growing anxiety that made his skin itch. It was the feeling of being trapped in a soundproof chamber, a vacuum where the only thing left to listen to was the sound of one's own sanity beginning to fray at the edges. Sarah leaned her head against Mark's shoulder, her breathing shallow and rapid, her ribs expanding and contracting against him like a trapped bird. The sound of her cotton sweater rubbing against his shirt was a dry, abrasive rustle that seemed disproportionately loud in the deepening quiet. She reached out to touch the lamp on the nightstand, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cold, ceramic base, but she did not turn it off. The fear of what the room would become without its jaundiced light was far greater than the discomfort of its sickly glow. They were 2 small, warm points of life in a vast, cold box of wood and fabric, and the realization of their isolation felt like a cold hand tightening around their throats. The grandfather clock in the distance, somewhere down in the cavernous lobby, began its slow, mournful chime for the 11th hour, the sound rising through the floorboards like a funeral dirge. The vibrations traveled up through the legs of the bed, a series of low-frequency hums that they felt in their teeth and their bellies. With every toll of the bell, the room seemed to shrink, the green wallpaper looming closer, the dark vines appearing to writhe in the periphery of their vision. When the final chime died away, it left behind a silence so absolute that it caused a sharp, piercing ring in their ears, a high-frequency scream of a world devoid of all sound. The 30th of December was now fully surrendered to the night, and they were officially bound by the agreement they had signed in the dim light of the lobby below. The jagged black sliver of the minute hand finally groaned into place, overlapping the Roman numeral for 12 with a heavy, final thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire frame of the clock. It was precisely 23 hours, and the room had been officially surrendered to the absolute silence demanded by the dry, paper-skinned men at the front desk. Mark felt the weight of that silence pressing against the back of his neck, a cold and suffocating presence that seemed to demand his submission. Instead of yielding, a sudden, sharp spark of rebellion flared in his chest, a manic heat that made the blood thrum in his fingertips. He felt a strange, intoxicating urge to shatter the stillness, to puncture the heavy, velvet atmosphere of room 404 with something vibrant and alive. His hand moved toward the nightstand, his fingers searching for the cold, smooth glass of his smartphone, which lay there like a dormant piece of obsidian in the jaundiced light of the lamp. The screen of the phone erupted into a harsh, clinical blue light that carved through the shadows of the room, casting a distorted, elongated version of Mark's face onto the heavy green wallpaper. He navigated the menus with a feverish intensity, his thumb clicking against the glass with a sharp, rhythmic sound that felt like a series of tiny gunshots in the oppressive quiet. With a final, decisive tap, he selected a jazz composition, something old, reedy, and thick with the sound of a wailing saxophone and a thumping bass. The music did not merely play, it exploded into the room, a chaotic swarm of notes that tore through the sterile air like a serrated blade through silk. The sound felt thick and tangible, as if the notes were physical entities swirling through the dust motes, reclaiming the space from the ancient, dusty silence that had held it for so long. Sarah flinched as the first notes hit her, her shoulders hunching toward her ears and her eyes darting toward the heavy oak door. For a heartbeat, she looked like a creature caught in a spotlight, her face pale and her lips parted in a silent gasp of alarm. Her skin was covered in a sudden rash of goosebumps, and she looked toward the wall shared with room 403 as if expecting a fist to come crashing through the plaster. But as the rhythmic thrum of the double bass began to pulse through the floorboards, the tension in her jaw began to melt away, replaced by a tentative, giddy smile. She looked at Mark, seeing the defiant glint in his eyes, and the sheer absurdity of their fear seemed to break her. A small, melodic sound escaped her throat, a laugh that was at first hesitant, then growing in strength until it was a clear, ringing bell that echoed off the high, shadowed ceiling. Mark reached out and took her hands, his palms warm and slightly damp against her cool skin. They began to move together, their bodies swaying to the smoky rhythm of the jazz, their feet tracing erratic patterns across the old crimson carpet. The texture of the carpet was coarse and dry, and their movement produced a constant, shushing sound that reminded Mark of dry leaves being ground into the earth. It was a dusty, ancient sound, but it was drowned out by the exuberant screech of the saxophone. As they spun, the shadows of the room seemed to whirl with them, the dark vines on the wallpaper appearing to dance in the periphery of their vision. They were no longer guests in a cold, decaying hotel, they were an island of noise and warmth in a sea of lightless, freezing stillness. Sarah's laughter grew louder, becoming a series of joyous, staccato bursts that ricocheted off the cold glass of the window and the porcelain of the vanity. It was a sound that didn't belong in a place like this, too bright, too full of blood and life, and for a moment, the room seemed to struggle to contain it. The heavy curtains stirred in the air displaced by their movements, the dark fabric swaying like the robes of a phantom. Mark felt a surge of triumph as he spun her around, his own laughter joining hers, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in his chest and pushed back the encroaching gloom. They were breaking the rule, shattering the agreement with every breath and every step, and the thrill of it was like a drug, making their hearts race with a frantic, rhythmic urgency. In the height of their momentum, Mark's hip caught the edge of the small wooden table where the wine had been sitting. The impact was sudden and jarring, sending a tremor through the furniture that caused the empty crystal wine glass to wobble on its base. It teetered for a fraction of a second, the light from the chandelier catching in its facets and throwing a fleeting, jagged rainbow against the wall. Then, it tipped over completely. The glass did not break, but it struck the floor with a high-pitched, crystalline chime that felt unnervingly sharp. It began to roll, its curved side creating a hollow, rhythmic clicking as it traversed the uneven floorboards beneath the carpet. It moved with a strange, guided purpose, heading straight for the baseboard of the wall that separated their room from the neighboring suite. The glass came to a stop with a dull, muffled thud against the wood, and as if a conductor had lowered a baton, the music on the phone suddenly reached the end of the track. The silence that rushed back into the room was not the same as before, it was heavier, more aggressive, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to strike. Mark and Sarah froze in the center of the room, their chests heaving as they fought to catch their breath. The sound of their respiration was the only thing left, a series of wet, ragged gasps that sounded terrifyingly loud in the sudden vacuum. They both stared at the glass lying against the wall of room 403, their bodies turning cold as the adrenaline of their dance began to drain away, leaving behind a hollow, aching dread. Mark strained his ears, his entire being focused on the thin, green-papered barrier of the wall. He expected to hear the sound of a neighbor complaining, perhaps a muffled shout or the rhythmic pounding of a fist against the wood. But there was nothing. The silence behind the wall was so dense it felt like a physical pressure against his eardrums, a thick, stagnant mass that seemed to suck the sound of their breathing into itself. It was the silence of a deep well or a sealed tomb, a void that felt inhabited but utterly motionless. He felt a bead of cold sweat trace a slow, agonizing path down his temple, and he realized that the absolute lack of reaction from the other side was far more terrifying than any angry outburst would have been. Sarah's hand tightened on Mark's arm, her fingernails digging into his skin through the fabric of his shirt. She didn't look at him, her eyes were fixed on the bottom of the wall where the glass lay, as if she expected something to reach through the floorboards and claim it. The air in the room felt different now, thicker, colder, and smelling more strongly of the cedar and old chemicals that had been lingering in the background. The shadows in the corner seemed to have crept forward while they were dancing, reclaiming the territory the blue light of the phone had momentarily stolen. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall had become a heavy, visceral beat, a mechanical heart that was counting down the seconds of their reprieve. Mark turned toward her, seeing the stark, white-knuckled fear in her posture, and he felt a sudden, desperate need to overwrite the terror with something else. He pulled her closer, his movements more forceful than before, seeking the heat of her body as a shield against the creeping chill of the room. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her perfume which was being slowly overtaken by the dusty smell of the hotel. He wanted to fill the room again, not with music this time, but with the visceral, undeniable sounds of the living. He wanted to drown out the silence of room 403 with the noise of their own existence, to prove to himself that they were still there, still real, and still in control of the space they occupied. He guided her toward the bed, the old floorboards beneath the carpet shrieking in a long, descending groan that sounded like a heavy gate being dragged over stone. They collapsed onto the scratchy, wine-colored wool of the bedspread, the springs below erupting in a chaotic, metallic symphony of protest. The sound was harsh and rhythmic, a series of sharp, discordant squeals that bit into the silence with every movement. Mark didn't care about the noise anymore, he welcomed it. He needed the bed to scream, he needed the sheets to rustle with the sound of sandpaper, and he needed the air to be filled with the sound of their effort. He pushed himself against her, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal trying to break free. The fabric of their clothes rubbed together, creating a dry, static-filled friction that seemed to hiss in the quiet. Sarah's breath was hitching, a series of small, sharp sounds that were caught in her throat, mirroring the frantic pace of the bed's mechanical groaning. The sound of the sheets being bunched up and kicked aside was a heavy, rhythmic shushing, a tidal sound that filled the room and pushed the shadows back toward the ceiling. Mark's own breath had become a deep, guttural rasp, a sound of pure physical exertion that echoed off the dark wallpaper and seemed to vibrate the very glass in the window. They were a storm of sound and heat, a frantic, desperate rebellion against the cold law of the Pine Ridge Hotel. As they moved together, the rhythm of the bed springs became a relentless, driving beat, a metallic pulse that seemed to synchronize with the heavy, oily clicking of the clock on the wall. The sound was all-encompassing, a cacophony of rustling fabric, heavy breathing, and the rhythmic, slamming contact of the bed frame against the headboard. Mark felt a sense of fierce, defiant joy as the noise reached a crescendo, a feeling that they were reclaiming their humanity from the dusty, silent history of the building. The room was no longer a tomb, it was a theater of noise, a place where the living asserted their dominance over the stillness. Every moan, every gasp, and every creak of the wood felt like a blow struck against the agreement they had signed. The air in the room grew hot and stifling, the smell of their sweat mingling with the scent of old dust to create a heavy, primal atmosphere. Sarah's fingers were tangled in the sheets, the sound of the wool being pulled taut creating a sharp, snapping noise that punctuated the larger rhythm of their movement. They were lost in the sound of each other, in the absolute rejection of the silence that lay waiting on the other side of the wall. In that moment, the fear was gone, replaced by a blinding, noisy focus on the present, on the heat of skin and the friction of movement. Finally, as the intensity began to fade and their movements slowed, the sounds of their intimacy began to taper off, leaving behind a ringing resonance in the air. The bed springs gave one last, long, drawn-out squeak before settling into a trembling stillness. The rustle of the sheets died down to a faint, papery whisper. Mark lay there, his skin slick with sweat, listening to the thunderous pounding of his own heart in his ears. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, and the silence seemed to be hovering just inches above them, waiting for the final echoes of their presence to dissolve so it could reclaim the room. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowly returning to a deep, rhythmic crawl, unaware that the true violation of the silence was only just beginning to stir in the darkness behind the wall. The passage of time in the aftermath of their transgression was measured only by the cooling of their skin and the slow, rhythmic settling of the hotel's ancient bones. Exactly 5 minutes had bled away since the last resonance of their presence had dissolved into the heavy, forest green wallpaper. Mark lay on his back, his chest rising and falling in a slow, decelerating cadence, watching the way the jaundiced light from the chandelier caught the microscopic particles of dust dancing in the stagnant air. The silence was no longer merely the absence of noise, it had become a pressurized, crystalline weight that seemed to vibrate against his eardrums with a low-frequency hum. Beside him, Sarah was a motionless silhouette, her presence marked only by the soft, rhythmic friction of her shoulder against the scratchy wool of the bedspread. The smell of the room had shifted, the sharp scent of their recent exertion now mingling with a metallic tang, like old coins left in a damp cellar. Then, the silence behind the wall of room 403 did not simply break, it was meticulously dismantled. A sound drifted through the lath and plaster, a sequence of melodic disturbances that coalesced into a laugh. It was not a generic laugh of a stranger, nor was it a muffled approximation, it was the exact, terrifyingly precise reproduction of the laugh Sarah had released only minutes before. Mark felt the air in his lungs turn to ice as he recognized the specific, crystalline pitch, the playful lilt in the middle, and that singular, sharp intake of breath at the very end. It was an acoustic photograph, a sonic ghost that had no right to exist in the cold vacuum of the neighboring room. The sound seemed to hang in the air of their own room, a shimmering, impossible echo that refused to dissipate, mocking the very concept of linear time. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous and visceral, a total paralysis that seemed to turn her limbs to stone. Mark watched in the dim light as her skin erupted in a violent wave of goosebumps, her flesh tightening over her bones as if trying to shrink away from the sound. She did not scream, she did not even move her head. Her eyes simply widened, the pupils dilating until they were twin voids of black ink reflecting the sickly yellow glow of the bulbs above. He could see the pulse in her neck throbbing with a frantic, stuttering rhythm, a visible manifestation of a heart trying to burst through its cage. The warmth they had shared moments ago was gone, replaced by a structural chill that seemed to radiate directly from the wall shared with the silent, empty suite next door. Before the echoes of the laugh could fully fade, a new layer of impossibility was added to the air. From the other side of the wall came the low, reedy groan of a saxophone, the notes muffled and distorted as if they were being played through a thick, wet veil or from deep beneath the surface of a dark lake. It was the same jazz composition Mark had played on his phone, the same erratic, smoky melody that had fueled their defiance of the hotel's rules. The timbre was slightly off, possessing a hollow, wooden quality that made the music sound ancient and rotted, yet the sequence of notes was identical. It played with a slow, deliberate cadence, the bass notes thumping against the wall like the steady, rhythmic beat of a giant, submerged heart. The music did not feel like it was coming from a device, it felt like it was being exhaled by the room itself. But the true horror began when the mechanical protest of the neighboring room commenced. The sound of bed springs, rusted and strained, began to erupt from behind the green-vined wallpaper. It was a rhythmic, agonizing squeal of metal against metal, perfectly synchronized with the cadence of the intimacy they had just concluded. Mark's breath hitched as he realized the timing was not just similar, it was a flawless imitation. Every frantic creak, every long-drawn groan of the frame, and every sharp, metallic snap of the springs was being replayed with a clinical, predatory accuracy. It was as if the room next door had been a recording device, and now, it was vomiting their own private moments back at them in a distorted, mocking symphony of friction and weight. The bed in room 404 remained silent, but the air within it vibrated with the phantom movements happening just inches away. The auditory assault then narrowed down to a terrifyingly intimate scale, shifting from the mechanical to the biological. Mark became aware of a sound that was closer, more persistent than the bed springs, the sound of breathing. From behind the wall, a deep, guttural rasping began to mirror his own respiration. Every time Mark drew air into his lungs, he heard the corresponding, wet slide of air through a throat on the other side. When he exhaled, the wall sighed back at him, a warm, moist sound that seemed to pass through the solid barrier as if the plaster were nothing more than porous skin. The mimicry was so perfect that Mark felt a sudden, dizzying sense of dissociation, as if his own lungs were being operated by a puppeteer standing in the dark of room 403. A cold, calculated curiosity overrode Mark's paralysis for a single, harrowing moment. He decided to test the entity behind the wall, to prove to himself that this was some elaborate trick of acoustics or a breakdown of his own sanity. He drew a long, deliberate breath, holding it at the very apex until his chest burned and the blood thundered in his temples. He waited, his entire being focused on the thin partition of the wall. The silence that followed was absolute. On the other side, the breathing stopped at exactly the same microsecond. There was no trailing exhale, no accidental twitch of a lung, only a dead, predatory stillness that mirrored his own. They stayed that way for what felt like an eternity, two beings locked in a silent, suffocating stalemate, separated only by a layer of wood and decaying wallpaper. When Mark finally relented, forced by the agony in his lungs to release his breath in a jagged, desperate gasp, the response from the wall was instantaneous. A matching gasp, wet and ragged, exploded from the other side, sounding so close that Mark instinctively pulled back, half expecting a face to press through the green vines. He sat up slowly, his joints clicking with a sound that felt like thunderclaps in the hypersensitive quiet of the room. His hands were trembling, his fingers cold and slick with a fine sheen of cold sweat. He looked at the wall, seeing the way the shadows cast by the chandelier seemed to pool along the baseboards like spilled ink, and he felt a desperate, irrational need to touch the source of the imitation. He slid off the bed, his bare feet touching the crimson carpet with a soft, shushing sound that was immediately echoed by a soft, shushing sound from the floorboards next door. Every movement he made, every shift of his weight, was being followed with a precision that defied the laws of physics. He approached the wall that divided the rooms, his eyes fixed on a particular cluster of dark, thorny vines in the wallpaper pattern. The air near the wall was noticeably colder, a localized pocket of freezing air that smelled of ancient dust and the ozone smell of a coming storm. He reached out his hand, his fingers splaying as he moved toward the surface, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. As his fingertips made contact with the wallpaper, Mark didn't feel the expected resistance of solid plaster. Instead, he felt a faint, thrumming vibration, a low-frequency pulse that felt like the purr of a massive engine or the heartbeat of a colossal beast. But beneath that vibration, there was something else, a counterpressure. As he pressed his palm flat against the wall, he felt a corresponding pressure from the other side, as if someone were placing their hand exactly against his, separated only by the thickness of the wall. He could feel the warmth of a palm, the subtle shift of fingers adjusting their grip, and the unmistakable sensation of a mirror image that was trying to push back into his space. He yanked his hand away as if the wall had turned into red-hot iron, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The final sound of the sequence was the one that broke his remaining composure. From the floor of room 403, near the baseboard where their own wine glass had rolled earlier, came a sharp, crystalline chime. It was the unmistakable sound of a glass tipping over and rolling across a hard surface. He heard the initial strike, the high-pitched ring of the crystal, and then the rhythmic, hollow clicking as it traversed the floorboards. It was the exact sound of his own accidental clumsiness from 10 minutes ago, replayed with a haunting, physical presence. He listened as the phantom glass rolled to a stop with a dull, muffled thud against the wood, precisely in the same spot where his own glass lay in the darkness of their room. The cycle was complete, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was filled with the terrifying realization that they were no longer alone in their own actions. The cold realization of their situation descended upon the room like a deluge of freezing, stagnant water, soaking through their skin and settling deep within their marrow. Sarah's body was racked with violent, uncontrollable tremors, her limbs jerking with a rhythmic instability that made the old bed frame beneath them rattle in a frantic, metallic cadence. She clung to Mark with a desperate, crushing strength, her fingernails digging into the meat of his forearms through the thick fabric of his flannel shirt. Her breath was coming in short, jagged hitches that sounded like a serrated blade being pulled through dry silk, each inhalation a struggle against the thickening, suffocating atmosphere of the room. The jaundiced light from the chandelier seemed to pulse in time with her panicked heartbeat, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the dark green vines of the wallpaper like the legs of 1,000 scuttling insects. In a moment of sheer, unadulterated terror, Sarah tilted her head back, her eyes wide and glassy, reflecting the sickly yellow glow of the bulbs above. Her jaw unhinged slightly, her lips trembling as she prepared to release a frantic, whispered plea for help or an explanation for the acoustic nightmare unfolding behind the wall. But before a single syllable could escape her throat, Mark's hand shot out, his palm pressing firmly against her mouth with a sudden, forceful urgency. He could feel the warmth of her breath and the dampness of her panicked tears against his skin, her muffled whimper vibrating against his palm like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. They sat in a suffocating, breathless stasis, their eyes locked in a silent exchange of primal fear, while the silence of room 404 became a physical presence, pressing against their eardrums until it induced a sharp, agonizing ring. The silence was shattered not by a scream, but by a predatory, acoustic theft that originated from behind the thin partition of room 403. From the darkness of the neighboring suite came a sound that froze the blood in Mark's veins, a perfect, muffled imitation of a female voice attempting to whisper, followed immediately by a low, wet sob. It was not a recording and it was not a natural echo, it was a living, breathing mockery of Sarah's aborted attempt at speech. The sob had a viscous, fluid quality to it, as if the throat producing the sound were filled with heavy, dark liquid or atrophied tissue. It hung in the air between the rooms, a shimmering, impossible distortion that seemed to feed on the very air they were breathing, leaving the atmosphere feeling thin and depleted of oxygen. Mark felt a sudden, volcanic surge of adrenaline override his paralysis, a desperate, defensive anger born from the absolute violation of their privacy. He shoved himself off the bed, the rusted springs erupting in a final, agonizing shriek of metal that seemed to echo through the floorboards and up into his very teeth. His feet struck the cold, abrasive texture of the crimson carpet with a heavy, rhythmic thud that was immediately mirrored by a corresponding thud from the other side of the wall. Every step he took toward the shared partition was a struggle against the invisible pressure of the room, his muscles tensing until they felt like overwound wires. He could smell the intensifying odor of ancient dust and the sharp, ozone-like tang of a coming storm, a scent that seemed to radiate directly from the green-vined wallpaper. Standing before the wall, Mark's shadow was thrown against the dark vines by the overhead light, a distorted, towering figure that looked alien and menacing. He pulled his right arm back, his knuckles white and his fist clenched so tight that the skin felt as though it might split open. With a sudden, explosive burst of motion, he drove his fist into the wall, aiming for the spot where the vibration of the hand had been felt earlier. The impact was a dull, heavy crunch of lath and plaster, the vibration traveling up through his wrist and shoulder with a jarring, bone-deep intensity. But the sound of the blow was not solitary, it was perfectly overlaid by an identical strike from the other side, occurring at the exact same microsecond. Bah! Bah! The two sounds fused into a single, terrifyingly loud explosion of noise that seemed to make the very foundations of the hotel tremble. Mark stood there, his fist still pressed against the wallpaper, feeling the heat of his own blood beginning to pulse in his knuckles. He could feel the counter-vibration of the other strike through the wood, a lingering, humming resonance that felt like a living thing trying to burrow into his skin. He began to breathe heavily, his chest heaving as he succumbed to hyperventilation, his inhalations becoming fast, shallow, and permissive. To his horror, the wall began to breathe with him, a rhythmic, synchronized expansion and contraction of air that emanated from the darkness of room 403. The sound from the other side was not clean, it was a wet, whistling rasp, as if the creature imitating him possessed lungs that were damaged, fluid-filled, or composed of something other than healthy flesh. The acoustic mimicry intensified, evolving into a sensory assault that threatened to shatter Mark's sanity. Every twitch of his finger, every shift of his weight on the creaking floorboards, and every rustle of his clothing was answered by a corresponding sound from behind the wall. The wall itself seemed to have become a semi-permeable membrane, no longer a solid barrier but a vibrating, resonant organ that was tuned to their every frequency. Mark felt a cold, oily sweat breaking out across his forehead, the droplets tracing slow, agonizing paths down his temples as he realized that the entity next door was not just listening, it was absorbing them. It was taking their sounds, their rhythms, and their very life signs, and processing them through a distorted, predatory filter that stripped them of their humanity. Sarah finally reached her breaking point, the tension in her chest exploding outward in a raw, jagged scream that tore through the stagnant air of the room. It was a sound of pure, unbridled terror, a high-pitched vibration that made the glass in the vanity mirror rattle and the dusty crystals of the chandelier chime together with a frantic, discordant ringing. She buried her face in her hands, her body curling into a tight, defensive ball on the edge of the bed. Her scream was long and unwavering, a desperate attempt to drown out the acoustic shadows that were closing in on them. But as her breath finally failed and the sound died in her throat, the wall responded with a terrifying, distorted version of the same cry. The sound that emerged from room 403 was not a human scream, it was an elongated, distorted howl that possessed the same duration and frequency as Sarah's, but with a tonal quality that was utterly alien. It sounded as if her voice had been shredded and then reassembled by a machine, or passed through the vocal cords of something with a cavernous, empty chest. The howl echoed through the vents and under the door, a hollow and predatory sound that seemed to vibrate the very air in their lungs. It was an acoustic digestion, the room next door acting as a giant throat that had swallowed her fear and was now belching it back in a form that made the original sound seem like a distant, pleasant memory. Terrified and defeated, Mark retreated from the wall, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated as he backed away toward the far corner of the room. He reached the edge of the bed and grabbed Sarah, hauling her toward the corner where the heavy wardrobe met the wall. They huddled together on the floor, their backs pressed against the cold, hard wood, their legs tangled in a frantic, desperate knot. The sound of their retreat, the frantic scuffling of shoes on carpet, the heavy thud of their bodies hitting the floor, was mirrored perfectly by a scuffling and a thud from the room next door. They sat in the shadows, two small, shivering points of warmth in a room that had become a predatory ear, listening to the rhythmic, wet whistling of the breathing that continued to pulse from behind the wallpaper. In the deepening gloom, the metaphor of the room as a biological entity became inescapable. It felt as though they were trapped inside the gullet of a massive, ancient organism that was slowly, methodically learning the map of their existence. Every sound they made was a piece of data being consumed, processed, and replicated until their own sense of self began to blur at the edges. Mark could feel the vibration of the hotel's internal pipes and the distant, mechanical clicking of the clock, and he realized that all of it was part of the same, singular intelligence. The silence of the Pine Ridge Hotel was not empty, it was a hungry, observant void that was preparing to speak their names in a voice that would sound more like them than their own. They remained there for hours, pinned to the floor by the sheer weight of the mimicry. If Mark scratched his neck, a dry, rasping sound echoed from the wall. If Sarah shifted her weight to ease the ache in her hip, a corresponding groan of floorboards answered from room 403. The isolation was absolute, the world outside the window having vanished into a lightless, soundless abyss where only the rhythmic tapping of the pine branches against the glass remained. They were no longer individuals, they were the source material for an acoustic haunting that was growing stronger with every passing minute. The air in the room grew colder still, the smell of rotten old paper intensifying until it was almost nauseating, a physical manifestation of the decay that had claimed the room and was now reaching out for them. As the first faint, gray light of the coming dawn began to bleed through the edges of the heavy curtains, the sounds from the neighboring room did not cease, but they became more subtle, more insidious. The wet, whistling breathing slowed to a rhythmic, subterranean thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and into their very bones. Mark looked at Sarah, her face a pale, gaunt mask of exhaustion and terror in the pre-dawn light, and he realized that they were being slowly erased. The room next door was no longer just repeating their sounds, it was anticipating them, the vibrations starting a fraction of a second before they even moved. They were being outpaced by their own shadows, trapped in a cycle of mimicry that offered no escape and no mercy, waiting for the sun to rise on a world that they might no longer be a part of. The gray dawn did not break over the horizon so much as it seeped through the heavy curtains like a slow, colorless poison, turning the room into a gallery of leaden shadows. As the first faint rays of light touched the jagged tops of the ancient pines outside, the symphony of mimicry from behind the wall ceased with a sudden, jarring finality. The wet whistling, the rhythmic creaking of the phantom bed, and the distorted howls all vanished, leaving behind a silence so dense and dusty it felt as though the room had been buried under 1,000 years of silt. Mark and Sarah remained huddled in the corner, their bodies stiff and aching from the night-long vigil, their skin the color of wet ash in the burgeoning light. The air smelled of stale sweat and the metallic tang of fear, a stagnant atmosphere that seemed to cling to their clothes and hair like a physical shroud. Sarah was the first to move, her joints producing a series of sharp, dry cracks that sounded like breaking twigs in the unnatural stillness of the room. Her eyes were sunken and underlined by dark, bruised circles, her gaze fixed on the wall of room 403 as if she expected the wallpaper to start breathing again. Mark reached out to help her up, his own hands trembling with a fine, rhythmic tremor that he could not suppress no matter how hard he clenched his fists. They moved with a frantic, uncoordinated urgency, their movements punctuated by the heavy, clumsy sounds of packing. The sound of zippers sliding over teeth was a series of jagged, metallic shrieks, and the thud of clothes being shoved into suitcases felt like weights being dropped into an open grave. They did not look at each other, nor did they look at the bed, they only looked for the door. The journey down the fourth-floor hallway was a descent through a velvet-lined tomb where the air was cold enough to turn their breath into faint, ghostly plumes. Their footsteps on the thick crimson carpet were muffled, yet the walls seemed to carry the vibration of their passage, the dark green vines of the wallpaper appearing to shiver in the periphery of their vision. As they passed the door to room 403, Mark felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea, his skin crawling as if 1,000 invisible insects were marching across his spine. The door to that room remained shut, a silent, impassive slab of dark oak that looked as though it had not been opened in an eternity, the brass number 3 glinting with a dull, malevolent light. They did not run, but their pace was a shambling, desperate hurry that echoed through the empty, cavernous well of the staircase. The lobby was a vast, amber-lit cavern where the smell of old wax and scorched paper was so thick it felt like a weight on the tongue. The morning light struggled to penetrate the grime-streaked windows, casting long, sickly bars of gray across the floorboards. Behind the heavy reception desk, the administrator sat as motionless as a statue carved from yellowed bone, his milky, cataract-clouded eyes fixed on the entrance as if he had been waiting for them to emerge from the depths of the building. His presence was a cold, stagnant vacuum in the center of the room, and the dry, papery rasp of his breathing was the only sound in the vast space. Mark approached the desk, his boots striking the floor with a hollow, echoing rhythm that seemed to travel up into the high, shadowed rafters. With a motion born of pure, jagged exhaustion, Mark reached into his pocket and produced the heavy brass key. He did not place it down, he hurled it onto the polished wood of the counter, where it landed with a sharp, discordant clang that rang through the lobby like a funeral bell. He gestured wildly toward the ceiling, his face contorted in a mask of silent rage, his throat working as he tried to convey the acoustic assault they had endured in the dark. He pointed toward the stairs, his finger shaking, as he demanded an explanation for the nightmare in the room next door. The old man did not flinch, his gaze remaining fixed on a point somewhere between Mark's eyes and the void behind him, his expression one of a terrible, ancient patience. The administrator's response was not a spoken word but a slow, rhythmic vibration of his throat, a sound like dry leaves being ground together in a stone mortar. He moved with an agonizingly slow deliberation, his hand rising to point toward a dusty, framed newspaper clipping hanging on the wall behind the desk. He conveyed through a series of low, rattling murmurs that room 403 had been sealed for precisely 10 years, ever since a tragic accident had claimed the lives of a young couple who had failed to honor the code of silence. The room had remained empty, a lightless void where no guest had set foot since the 30th of December, 2015. The old man's voice possessed a hollow, resonant quality that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Mark's bones, making the air in the lobby feel thick and difficult to swallow. Mark felt the world tilt on its axis, a cold, sickening vertigo washing over him as he stared at the clerk's impassive face. He reached across the desk, his fingers brushing against the cold, dry surface of the wood, and seized the heavy, leather-bound registration ledger. He began to flip the pages back, his movements frantic and violent, the sound of the thick, cream-colored paper tearing and rustling like the wings of a dying bird. He flipped through weeks, then months, then years, the ink of the entries growing fainter and more archaic as he delved into the hotel's past. The smell of vinegar and ancient, decaying glue rose from the spine of the book, a scent of rot that made his eyes water and his chest tighten with a suffocating pressure. He searched until his fingers were stained with the black dust of the ledger, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps that echoed off the high ceiling. Finally, his eyes landed on a page dated the 30th of December, 2015. There, at the bottom of the list for room 404, he saw his own signature, the ink dark and heavy, the loops of the letters identical to the ones he had written only 24 hours ago. Beside it was Sarah's name, written in her own neat, sloping hand, a signature that was a perfect, terrifying mirror of her living self. Mark's heart began to hammer against his ribs with a slow, heavy thud that sounded like a drum being struck in a distant room, his pulse a frantic, irregular rhythm in his throat. The true horror lay in the final column of the ledger, where the status of the guests was recorded in thick, glossy black ink that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Across the entries for both their names, a single word had been written in a sprawling, elegant script that occupied the entire width of the page. The word was, echo. The ink was so black it seemed to absorb the gray light of the lobby, a void on the paper that suggested an ending without a resolution. Mark stared at the word until his vision began to blur, the letters appearing to writhe and shift like the vines on the wallpaper upstairs, turning into a sequence of jagged, vibrating lines that defied his attempt to read them. Behind him, Sarah stood near the heavy oak doors of the entrance, her silhouette a dark, trembling shape against the gray light. She inhaled sharply, a quiet, permissive sound that was meant to catch Mark's attention, a small, human noise of fear and fatigue. But Mark did not hear the sound from the woman standing only 10 feet away. Instead, the sound of her breath erupted from the shadows of the staircase, echoing down from the lightless hallways of the upper floors. It was a perfect, crystalline reproduction of her inhalation, but it carried the hollow, metallic resonance of the hotel's ancient pipes. The sound did not dissipate, it lingered in the air, a sonic ghost that seemed to be traveling through the walls, reclaiming its place in the acoustic memory of the building. Mark looked down at his own hands and felt a cold, numbing sensation wash over his skin, starting at his fingertips and moving upward toward his heart. He watched, paralyzed, as the sharp outlines of his fingers began to soften and vibrate, the flesh and bone losing their density. His skin was no longer solid, It was becoming a blur of high-frequency motion, a series of translucent, shimmering waves that rippled with every beat of his heart. He tried to grip the edge of the ledger, but his fingers passed through the paper like a gust of wind, leaving no mark and no sound. He was losing the weight of his own existence, his physical form being converted into a sequence of vibrations that were being pulled back toward the room on the 4th floor. The sounds of the hotel began to amplify, the ticking of the grandfather clock becoming a thunderous, rhythmic slamming that vibrated through the floorboards. The wind whistling through the eaves was a high-pitched, agonizing scream that filled his skull, and the slow, papery rasp of the administrator's breath became a roaring tide that threatened to drown him. Mark looked toward Sarah and saw that she, too, was beginning to fade, her form becoming a hazy, acoustic distortion against the gray light of the windows. They were no longer guests, they were the very air of the Pine Ridge Hotel, a pair of sounds that had been caught, recorded, and replayed until the original source had simply worn away. The final realization was a cold, absolute weight that settled in his chest as his vision began to dissolve into a sea of gray static. The agreement they had signed was not a rule of conduct, but a sentence of transformation. By breaking the silence, they had provided the hotel with the raw material it needed to sustain itself, their voices and movements becoming the new layers of a haunting that would repeat for another 10 years, and 10 years after that. They were the echoes that would haunt the next couple to walk through those doors, the rhythmic bed springs and the wet whistling breathing that would keep the silence alive. Mark tried to scream, to make one last, definitive sound of rebellion, but all that emerged from his fading throat was a faint, distorted hiss that was instantly swallowed by the dusty, hungry quiet of the lobby. As the sun finally rose above the trees, the lobby of the Pine Ridge Hotel was once again still and empty. The administrator reached out a withered hand and closed the heavy registration ledger, the sound of the cover hitting the pages a dull, final thud that did not echo. The brass key for room 404 lay on the counter, its surface cold and untarnished, waiting for the next signature to be carved into the silence. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a soft, shushing sound that sounded like 1,000 whispered names, but there was no one left to hear them. The cycle was complete, the 30th of December was over, and the hotel was once again a silent monument to the sounds that had been lost within its walls.